Ruthless Compassion is a podcast about people who've turned their emotional shit into fertilizer for success. It's about seeing our darkest moments as opportunities for growth and transformation. Jillian Richardson helps people find a sense of belonging within themselves and their relationships. She is the author of Unlonely Planet, a guide to creating a strong sense of community. She's also the creator of The Joy List, a weekly newsletter of events and tools that help people create more connection in their life. When she's not facilitating workshops or coaching one-on-one, you can find Jillian writing poems and talking to every dog she meets. Welcome, Jillian Richardson, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Marcia.
I'm very happy to have you here because I've been thinking about and writing about loneliness a lot lately, and especially given our COVID-19 pandemic, it's really become a very significant issue. I was just wondering how you ended up becoming an expert on loneliness and the cure for loneliness.
Well, I got interested in loneliness, I think, the way a lot of people get obsessed with something, which is my own personal experience. You could call me kind of the archetype of a wounded healer, where I grew up feeling really lonely, like a lot of people did, where my parents were not taught the emotional skills to really attune with me and what I needed and my feelings. And so it's not to put blame on them, but to say a lot of people in their generation just didn't learn those skills. And so in my family unit, I felt really lonely and misunderstood. And that kind of transferred over into my relationships with my friends and other people, where I really internalized this lesson that it's not okay for me to show my true self. It's not okay for me to be sad or angry or messy or vulnerable and to just hide all of those parts of myself. And because I wasn't really being expressed, I didn't feel understood. And that leads to loneliness. And so when I moved to New York City as an adult after graduating from college, I really made it a point to say, I need to find better people. I need to find people who will lift me up, help me feel like a better version of myself. And I didn't really know why I was doing it at the time. Like, I didn't realize what the problem necessarily was. I just knew I didn't feel understood. And when I started to find people who were more expressed themselves, it was like they gave me permission to really step into my own as a person.
That's lovely. How did you go about finding these people?
So it started in a really random way, where I'd kind of had this realization of, I was in college and I was mostly surrounded by comedy kids. I did sketch and improv comedy all throughout college. And when I moved to New York City, I just naturally gravitated to the same people and assumed that it would be different. Like that because I was around adults in the comedy world, they would be like more mature or more emotionally available. And in my experience, that was not the case. Mm-hmm. And when I made this decision of, I just want to meet new people, I'm going to go to events, I'm going to do whatever it takes to find a new community, I got this email from some events and newsletter I was subscribed to, and it was promoting this experience called Camp Grounded, which is a digital detox summer camp for adults. It's kind of like Burning Man in that you don't use your real name, you make up a name. Not like Burning Man in that it is sober and there's no technology, there's no talk about work, there's no talk about age. So it was very self-selecting for the type of person who was pretty comfortable in themselves, ready to have an adventure, ready to put themselves out there. And that was one of the first things I did. And it totally changed my perception of what was possible in adulthood, to see these people who were just so free and silly and emotional. I'd honestly never met adults like that before.
Camp Grounded, is that something that's still going on today, or was that just something that happened for a little while?
Well, so the founder of Camp Grounded, Levi, he passed away and the ownership of the camp transferred over to a new person. It was going to happen this year, but then COVID happened. So whenever the world gets back to normal, Camp Grounded is still a thing that you can do. And they do retreats for companies as well.
It sounds like a wonderful thing, because it basically strips off your masks, right? Your job mask and your age mask and your tech mask and your social status mask, and you just have to be a person, right?
Totally. And then that we meet people only with the present moment. Like there was this woman whose camp name was Dolphin, and I was volunteering, so we ended up volunteering a lot together and having a lot of conversations, and we got really close. I had no idea she was 30 years older than me and had 3 children and was a lawyer. Like, if we'd met each other with those identities, we probably wouldn't have become friends because I'm a 22-year-old living in New York City. But we just met as we were, as people, and it created the conditions for a really great relationship.
That's lovely. So you went to Camp Grounded. How did that transition into you writing The Unlonely Planet and becoming a loneliness specialist?
So what happened after that was, first of all, I learned that a space can be really magical when it has rules. Like, I really think that Camp Grounded was so special because of all of these agreements that people had to sign off on in order to be in this really specific container. And I started to get kind of hooked on finding places like that in New York City. Like, where are the places that have facilitated conversations? They're sober. There's kind of these rules that people have to bend around, maybe get a little uncomfortable in order to connect. Mm-hmm. And that became kind of like my hobby, was finding these spaces. And the timing of this is very weird, but I started my newsletter called The Joy List after Donald Trump was elected in November 2016, because it was this very weird juxtaposition where I was surrounded by love and community and these incredible people who just wanted the world to be a more connected place. And then Donald Trump is elected, and I'm hearing people saying things like, people are bad, I can't trust anyone, just like the world is on fire, essentially. And I just wanted people to know that every day of the week in New York City, there is a place where they could go, be in community, and kind of just get recharged. And that's what started the project. And what continued the project was when I started sending out this, essentially an events newsletter, people started emailing me their stories of loneliness. And it really touched my heart. And people who I never would have expected, people who I'd never met, people who didn't even live in New York City and somehow found out about this. Like, people were coming up to me at parties and telling me their stories of loneliness. And I just realized I'd really tapped into this like shameful secret that a lot of people were holding. And that kind of led me on this path of researching it more and realizing, in this world of quote unquote like loneliness research, most of the thought leaders are older white men. And there wasn't many voices who were younger people or women. And I just felt inspired to write a book from my perspective of what people can do to find community.
And this is not just a book for young people, right? This is a book Completely. For people of all ages.
Yes. I've been honestly really surprised that some of the biggest fans of my book have been people in their 50s and 60s.
Well, I think our society is not very friendly to people who are in their 50s and 60s, right?
Completely. It's really interesting to me to notice, like, in these spaces that I'm talking about, like ecstatic dance in New York City or these big meditation gatherings, are often folks in their 20s and 30s, which I attribute to people being single and they're kind of exploring, they're wanting to find partners. And then when it gets to older generations, I have heard from people that they feel shy going to those spaces because they don't want to stick out. They're not sure if they're welcome. They don't want to be weird. And so I've really made it a point when I host my own events in the city to make them intergenerational, because it's just, this is the thing I talk about in my book as well. It's so unnatural to only be around people within our own generation. That's not how we were wired, and that's not how we learn.
Right. You know, in older societies, lots of people would intermingle of different ages. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So in your book, you talk about 7 steps to kind of create a framework for people to have their own, social group that is a good one for them, right? An intimate, close one. So can we go through those steps and kind of talk about, how to do so, like your to-do list, right? For creating good connections. So the first one is getting friendtimate. What do you mean by that?
So friendtimate, it's a term by this author named Shasta Nelson, who is a friend of mine. She wrote a book called Friendtimacy. She's actually written a number of books on the art of friendship. And it's saying that we don't only have intimacy in our romantic relationships. And I actually believe that, especially in America, we're obsessed with romantic relationships so much because we don't have intimacy in any other areas of our life. Or we might have kind of shallow working relationships with our colleagues. Our friends are just people we knew in college, and our conversations don't go that deep. We don't feel very seen by them. There's not intimacy. And so people just say, all right, well, I need to get a romantic partner because that's the socially acceptable place for me to get love and connection. And it doesn't have to be that way. So by saying getting friendtimate, I'm saying learn how to foster intimacy in the realm of friendship. Ask people better questions. Be a better listener. Be around the types of people who inspire you. Don't just settle for whoever happens to be around you right now. A lot of people, they kind of just go on autopilot and surround themselves with whoever and don't realize, like, you can really curate the people around you to be inspiring and help you live a more positive, joyful life.
Right. I've heard that a lot, where people are so lonely and desperate that if somebody comes along, they'll just say, okay. And they don't even question whether this person is a good person, a kind person, a person who shares their values, anything. Mm-hmm. They're just happy to have a body.
Yeah. And of course, I completely understand that, especially during a pandemic, like this mentality of got to take what I can get. And so I think in regular times, I think that's really the power of going to events that are kind of centered around a positive intention, like a meditation event, a book club, a women's group, a men's group, that typically draws a lot of people who are really positive and working on themselves, so that people can open their minds and realize, like, oh, okay, I might have a story that really positive friendships are rare, and to kind of break that story by consistently putting themselves in spaces that prove otherwise.
Nice, nice. So the next step on your list is creating an alternate universe. What do you mean by that?
I love this one so much. So again, I mentioned before this idea of being in spaces that have rules and agreements. And I love events that have agreements that you need to kind of sign off on before you enter, because you know that everyone around you has something in common with you. Like, okay, everyone who's here, they were willing to put their phones away and be present. A lot of people aren't comfortable with that. So it's kind of self-selecting. And an example I give of this in the book is this dance space in New York City called the Get Down, which is a space where there's no drinks on the dance floor. There's not talking on the dance floor. And so you've just got to be the kind of person who's willing to be present, moving your body in space with people. And the first time I attended that event, I was so deeply uncomfortable. I was like, who are these people? What is this world? Like, the way people are operating here is so different than anything I've seen, which is usually people getting really drunk and then like awkwardly dancing, not really putting themselves into it. Like, that's kind of the culture I grew up in. And so seeing people completely sober, like arms wrapped around each other, sweaty, singing at the top of their lungs. To me, that felt like a completely alternate universe, and like people creating the types of spaces that they want to see more of. I think that's an art form that people don't appreciate that much.
It's really interesting you're saying this because for many years I've run groups, therapy groups in my practice, and my group therapy had a ton of rules. Now we're on a hiatus. Who knows if it's temporary or permanent due to COVID, but up until COVID, I was having, 2 groups a week, and the rules were obviously no phones, and you're not allowed to ask personal questions. All you can do is either share what's going on or give feedback. And the only way to give feedback is to express how you feel about what you've heard, or to demonstrate how you can relate or connect to it. You cannot analyze, you cannot judge, you cannot ask questions, and you cannot, make a philosophical or general commentary. And I basically insisted on those rules, and I enforced them. And what happened was these groups became deeply, deeply intimate and incredibly powerful vehicles for healing. And the people loved the group, and they would come. There were people who were coming to group on a weekly basis for years, and like over a decade. So I can really see how creating that structure and that rule that creates the opportunity for intimacy is super powerful, whether it's in a group therapy setting or in a social setting.
I love that. And I'm such a nerd for group healing spaces like that. And so thank you for being that space holder for people that allows them to heal each other. Like, I know that's really powerful and also kind of taxing work.
And the wonderful thing about it was that by practicing this kind of intimacy in the group, they developed all sorts of skills on how to listen deeply and how to be fully present with each other without being in that kind of analytical, intellectual way. So they could go out of the group and then they could build relationships with those tools. So I like that. And it was a really fun group to be part of, to be present in that space, watching people connect that way.
Yeah. And I imagine it's also a filter for them to see who they don't want to spend time with.
Absolutely.
Like that's been a huge thing for me, is like, okay, I'm in these spaces, like you said, where people are sharing and they're being vulnerable. And now it's so obvious to me if I'm in a different type of space where I'm like, okay, like people are using alcohol and the conversations are kind of mean or snarky. Like, I'm out of there so fast. And before that, I just would have hung out because I wouldn't have known any better.
One other rule I had is you're not allowed to complain. You can talk about what's going on, but you cannot complain, because I said complaining is toxic and we're not doing anything toxic in the group. So no one's, but do you notice how many people like spend their whole conversation just complaining?
I feel like it's been such a transformation for me recently, because I'm so not used to that. So when I hear people do it, I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, what are we doing with, why are we supposed to bond over this? And that's kind of the point, I imagine, is for like there to be some sort of solidarity and suffering.
Right. The shared misery, but it's misery.
I'm like, no, thank you. I'll pass.
So that's your alternative universe. So now we're talking about our next point, which is sharing with strangers. So obviously not sharing about your complaints, but why don't you talk to me a little bit about sharing with strangers?
Well, so I love spaces like your group therapy spaces where people don't know each other and they have permission to share about what's going on in their lives. And especially if they have some sort of shared struggle. So I like any 12-step meeting is incredible, because you walk into this space with people you've never met and you hear people sharing from their heart and commiserating with each other. And it's not complaining. It's really being open and raw about what they are struggling with, which is different. And again, just such an incredible model of what is possible in conversation. I'm in a different 12-step group, but I've been to a good handful of AA meetings because I'm also sober. And walking into those meetings, I always leave feeling so moved, just hearing people sharing the hardest parts of their life with a room of people, most of them they don't know. and just seeing like, oh, this is what people look like without their masks on.
Yes, and that group also has rules about confidentiality and create safety, right? And I think what you're kind of implying here is that there has to be safety for intimacy, right? You have to build in the safety.
Like, I'm not going to walk up to someone at a party and start talking about my relationship with alcohol randomly. Like, that's not a socially acceptable behavior. But if I walk into an AA meeting, like, I know this is the intention of this space, and people hold it really sacred.
Yeah. And I like that about, spaces with rules. Like, a lot of people these days think, oh, rules are old fashioned and rules are oppressive and rules, prevent us from expressing our creativity. But what I have found is it's the opposite. Rules create that safety net within which we can really soar.
Oh, completely. And I think an assumption people have about me is that I'm a really extroverted person. And I'm like, well, actually, if you just dropped me into a networking event that has no facilitation and it's a room of 100 people, I'm going to be anxious as hell. Like, I will want to get out of there. And that's why I curate a newsletter of events that are facilitated, because those are the spaces where I feel safe enough to really step into my extroverted side and be open and silly or vulnerable, because I know it's okay. And other spaces can feel really, really draining for me, because it's just like, what are we doing here? What are we talking about? Why are there just 100 people with name tags all sizing each other up? Like, this sucks.
Right. There's no rules. There's no structure, and you feel adrift. Yeah. And unless you're a very, plus extrovert, it's not going to work for you.
No. And if you're an energetically sensitive person like I am, like, I consider myself empathetic, those spaces, there's just way too much going on.
And probably a lot of other people sitting on some anxiety that you're picking up, right?
Oh, yeah. It's like, oh, wow. Like, I remember one time, I don't know why I decided to go to this. It was some huge Halloween party in New York City. And it was like in this kind of mansion style house. And I walked in and it's packed. And my roommates just saw me over the course of 5 minutes just completely collapse into myself. And I was not anxious before we walked in. And it's hard for me to realize, like, oh, this is not my anxiety. This is the anxiety of all of these people around me who are working to hide it.
Yeah. So speaking of that, let's move on to the next point, which is seeking spiritual guidance. How do you incorporate that into your steps?
Thank you for keeping me on track. I can wander off on all these directions.
It's okay. We'll pull you back in.
Yes. So the spiritual guidance part is very close to my heart. This is something I've been thinking a lot about during quarantine. And this is the thing that's also discussed in the 12 steps, is they say, like, okay, a spiritual disease requires a spiritual solution. And I think that America as a country is really spiritually malnourished. Like, even people who attend church, I find that when I talk to a lot of people who are part of organized religion and I tell them, or I ask them, do you feel connected to God? Do you feel connected to some sort of higher power? A lot of them will say no. And I found that the people who take the time to really cultivate their own personal relationship with some sort of higher power or spirituality, they tend to be much more grounded, self-aware people, because they've designed this themselves. They're not just kind of taking stuff on blind faith and not really connecting, or there's not some sort of embodied relationship with spirit. And so in the book, I really suggest you to find our own spiritual path and drop ourselves into communities where people talk about what is spirituality. And in the book, a big emphasis is community outside of organized religion, because organized religion has been tainted for so many people and for very good reason. And to know that you don't have to be part of an organized religion to get guidance from someone spiritually. Like, I have priests and nuns in my life. I don't consider myself a Christian or a Catholic. I just love talking to them. I have Buddhist monk friends. I'm not a Buddhist either. I just really like talking to them and learning from them. And that these kinds of conversations, or just conversations with friends where you talk about poetry, you talk about music that moves you. These are all ways to connect to spirituality that might sound frivolous, but I really think without them, life can be pretty lackluster.
Yeah, I go for a walk most days for about an hour. And lately I've been doing it in the morning because of the time change. And I just feel very connected to the universe, kind of at one with the universe when I'm walking and the sun is shining and I'm walking under the trees. It's a lovely spiritual experience, I think.
Yeah. And that's spiritual. It's like taking a walk. Like anything can be spiritual as long as you have that awareness.
For sure. And so your next step is finding healing spaces. So we've been talking a lot about that, but maybe you want to say a couple more things about that.
Yeah. And this connects as well to the group therapy you were talking about. But I think that a lot of companies, they have these budgets for quote unquote personal development, and people aren't necessarily sure what that means or how broad that can go. And I gave a talk at a conference where I suggested that companies give suggestions of healing spaces that their employees can go to. Like, for example, if someone in their company is a survivor of sexual assault, like it would be really beneficial for them to be in a women's group of sexual survivors. Or if they're feeling just really not connected to other men in their life, to go on a men's retreat, do a men's circle. Like these are all different types of healing that they're not a Tony Robbins retreat. They're not landmark, which is kind of what people usually think of. There's so many different flavors of healing where it's like, it's not appropriate for you to do this with your colleagues at work, but by healing those parts of yourself, you're just going to show up as a more integrated, full person. And that's good for a company if they care about their employees.
Absolutely. And I've certainly seen over the years how much the workplace is affected by the mental health of each individual at work. And, whether it's, at the lowest level or at the managerial level, there's a lot of bad stuff that goes on in the workplace when people have unresolved emotional issues.
Completely. It's not discussed enough. And just one more point I'll make on this is I was talking on a podcast about work culture, and the man who was hosting it was kind of suggesting like, well, wouldn't it be beneficial for a bunch of employees to go through one of these kind of healing, heart-opening experiences together? And I'm like, maybe, but also I think there's a risk in companies trying to get every aspect of an employee's identity to be connected to a company. It's like, we're humans outside of work. We don't need to do everything with their company. Like, I think that's unhealthy and borderline manipulative behavior. This needs to be outside of the workplace without your company involved.
Yeah, I would strongly disagree that that kind of experience should be shared with colleagues, because with your colleagues, you really need boundaries because it's a completely different kind of relationship. It's much more transactional. Colleague relationships are the opposite of intimate, right? Yeah. and workplace relationship. And that's okay, because that's the kind of environment it is. But you don't want to be fudging those boundaries between a transactional kind of interaction and this, profoundly intimate interaction. And then you get into the workplace the next, after the weekend, and you're feeling so overly exposed and vulnerable. And it makes interacting with your colleagues extremely fraught, because you don't know what, it's like you've become naked with each other. And now you have to go back and, have all your layers back on, but everyone has seen each other naked. I don't think that's a really emotionally naked. But I don't think it's a great idea. Yeah.
Yep. I agree. I imagine he might have suggested this because he doesn't have the embodied experience of being in a container like that. Like, if you've done this, I think you would understand why this isn't appropriate to do with colleagues.
And again, that's where those rules come in, right? Like how you create the structure, how you create the rules to create that safety so that people don't have an experience that is, turns out to be, hurtful or negative in some way. Yeah. So now we're talking about the next step is incorporating ritual, which I love just that that word ritual. What can you say about that?
I think this really ties into kind of this spiritual impoverishment that people are facing, just like this complete disconnection from culture. And just looking at my own life and my own family, like my mom is an immigrant from Ireland. We don't have really rituals in my family of origin. And so the more research I did on rituals and how they tie you to your community, to your culture, I realized when I started to integrate more things like that, I feel connected to a sense of time and a sense of kind of the cyclical nature of the year. And without rituals, it doesn't feel that way. Like I imagine during quarantine, Halloween, I appreciated Halloween so much more this year. Like I felt emotional walking around New York City, seeing these families and these kids in costumes, just like, oh my God, in this weird timeless loop. Like this is something that we can use to mark time. And that feels really beautiful.
I think, there are natural rituals, just like the turning of the seasons, the solstices and the equinoxes and all these holidays and all these ritualized events really do mark time, and they mark another year, another festival, another holiday, another event. And I think that's very important in terms of creating that sense of our place in the world, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that's just an invitation for people who are listening, is to think about like, what culture are you from? And do you know any rituals that are from that culture? Like for me, I didn't know any Irish rituals. And actually for Halloween, I did my own ritual in my apartment for Samhain, which is the Irish turning of the seasons. And it's kind of like the Irish Day of the Dead. And it's on Halloween. And until this year, I had no idea that was even a thing. And I'm like, wow, I really like, this is an important holiday in my culture.
That's nice. See, there's always time for us to come back to our culture.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So your last point in your 7 steps to being able to create better community is stepping into leadership, which obviously you've done, but maybe you want to talk about how other people can do it.
Yeah. So the last chapter, I talk about why we should create the spaces that we want to see in the world. Because chances are, if you're feeling lonely, disconnected, if you're wishing like, oh man, I wish me and my girlfriends would do a biannual trip somewhere, or I would really love to start a men's group with my male friends, but I feel shy. Just knowing if you're feeling that way, people probably want something and you are in choice to create it. And that's a brave thing to do. There's a chance that people might say no. There's a chance you might have to invite people you don't know, but the world really needs people who are brave enough to call themselves gatherers. We need more meaningful gatherings. I really, truly believe that. And that takes vulnerability to put yourself out there. And this is not a thing for everyone. Like if you're a single mom during quarantine, yeah, you're not going to be, you don't have the bandwidth to do something like this. And that's totally fine. But if you're a single 20-something who's just got a ton of time on your hands, you're in choice to make something. Also in the book, I really make a point to emphasize that if you're someone like me who has chosen to make gathering into your profession, like this is my path, to acknowledge that societally, people do not really value this yet. Like we haven't really reached the point of seeing like event design and community gathering and ritual makers as something that's very financially valued. And just, I really want to share that it's a hard path to take if you want to do this full time. Like, and I don't want to sugarcoat that, because I wish things were different. I wish more companies would hire people who are artists and creatives who are really skillful at gathering instead of just doing something half-hearted internally. I'm seeing that shift slowly happening, but it's going to take a while.
Yeah, well, when you're a visionary, the world has to catch up with you.
Yeah.
You have to catch up with your vision.
I'm impatient. Patience is not one of my virtues.
Well, that can be a good thing, because then you're going to push harder to make your vision manifest, right?
Mm-hmm. But guys, let's just care about each other. Come on.
Yeah, but don't you think the world now, the seeds of division have been so deeply sown, and the politics, especially in the United States, are so more divisive than ever. They're so us versus them. And we can really see that so strongly. And people are so angry and polarized. I wrote an article just recently about how political divisions create a lot of mental health problems. And we are so polarized now. So it's an interesting time for you to be stepping into when people are feeling so unconnected to each other and so at odds with one another. And even there's a lot of hate toward groups of people, right? There's a lot of very obvious hate speak out on the internet and from, the mouths of certain politicians. So, it's an interesting time for you to be stepping into trying to create more love and more community and more oneness.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting time. It feels like it's needed. And it's just one thing that drives me absolutely nuts is when people say that it's naive to believe in love, when there's a speaker, a guy who used to be a pastor named Rob Bell, and he talks about kind of why it drives people crazy when there's like racism and divisiveness aside from the obvious. And he says, like, a lot of these very conservative ideals are rooted in hate and fear. And hate and fear is taking us backwards. It's like we're going into the past, and that's not how people work. We work in terms of progress. And so if you're coming from a place of love, you're looking towards the future, you're moving forwards, and that's how things move. We move forwards. And it's just a perspective that I wish more people would see.
Well, I guess if you keep doing what you're doing, more people will see it.
Yeah.
Keep being patient.
I'm really working on talking to more people who hold different values than me. It's surprisingly hard to find people who are willing to chat. So if anyone who's listening to this podcast, if you're someone who you consider yourself a hardcore Republican, hardcore conservative, I would love to just chat.
Right. Well, you've heard the offer, people. We'll put Jillian's contact info up on the show notes. So if somebody wants to, have a respectful, polite conversation about your different ideas, that would be wonderful. Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. So speaking of which, what are you doing these days in the time of COVID when, gathering is somewhat more constrained?
Yeah, so I've been doing a lot of online courses that teach relational skills, like how to connect to ourselves, how to connect to other people in a deeper way. And so right now I'm working with my colleague, Sean Galanos, who is a love coach and a relationship coach. And we're teaching a course on confidence, which we actually started yesterday. And it's something that you can join live or purchase the recordings later. We got some feedback from our first session yesterday, and the feedback was so sweet. And people were really reflecting how much they appreciate just the love and the care of the environment that we created virtually. And people left feeling more hopeful. They left feeling kinder to themselves. And that's really, I think, the space that we all need right now in a time with so much chaos and hate, to just be softer on ourselves, which maybe you wouldn't associate with a course on confidence, but that's kind of our goal.
Absolutely. No, that sounds wonderful. And how can people find you if they're looking to participate in any of your offerings now and in the future?
So if you're an Instagram person, I am at that Jillian, also on Twitter. And if you want to subscribe to my newsletter or find out about my courses, you can go to joylist.nyc. It's joylist.nyc, and you can find the courses there.
Fantastic. And just before we go, I always like to ask my guests to offer a call to action to the listener. And obviously there were a lot of call to actions that have been woven through this conversation, but maybe one final one so that you can leave them really thinking about that.
Yeah, well, so since this conversation is happening during quarantine, I'm guessing a lot of people listening have been with the same few people for a long time now. They might be driving you crazy. You're not sure how to have better conversations. And so my invitation is to make a list of questions that you wish people would ask you, that you think would start a really interesting discussion. And if you've never asked them to the people around you, ask them. Because you can't have a new conversation if you don't ask a new question.
That's fantastic. I'm going to write that list too. I love that idea.
Thank you. It's like, oh, I'm so bored. I'm like, well, ask you. Of course, you're going to talk about the same stuff if you don't bring something new up.
It's so funny because I was bored with the food I've been eating. So I've been teaching myself how to cook new recipes. But I think if you're bored with the conversations you're having, you can do the same thing, right? You can teach yourself new conversations.
Completely. I love that connection.
That's wonderful. Well, it's really been a pleasure chatting with you today, Jillian. It's you're doing good work, the good work. And,
thank you, Marcia.
Hopefully we'll be able to gather in person in the future and not just virtually.
Oh, amen. Soon.
Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast, and take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.
That was the delightful Jillian Richardson, and I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. If you like this podcast, please review it wherever you listen. And you can sign up for my free bi-weekly wellness newsletter at marciasirotamd.com, where you'll also learn about my new online courses and my YouTube series on coping with COVID.